Well, greetings, folks, from the greatest capital city and the greatest state and the greatest country in the history of the world. We can still say that in spite of the embarrassment that those of us who are Texans, being very proud of our state and culture, faced last week. Those of you who have suffered from electrical outages, from continuing water shortages, our prayers and thoughts are with you. What I can tell you is that while Texas government and policy failed miserably over the last week and a half, what didn't fail, as always, is Texans. Texans and our civil society are very strong. I think as we look at the sun shining, not just here in Austin today, but across the great state of Texas, we know that we will learn from this disaster last week and we will move on. I'm Kevin Roberts. I have the privilege of serving as the executive director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and it is a great privilege to welcome what I'm sure will be several thousand friends from all over the world who are asking the same question we are. What in the world happened to the energy state last week? Joining me today are some great friends, Jason Isaac, who heads up our Life Powered initiative, Emily Pataki, who is board member and president of the greatest electric utility in the world. I happen to be a proud customer, and that is true, the Pedernales Electric Co-op, and Chuck DeVore, another TPPF colleague, our vice president of national initiatives. What we're going to do today, based on the expertise of these three friends, is explain what happened last week. And I will agree, it's a man-made problem. It's a man-made problem in the form of man-made terrible policy that got us here. So if you're looking for some mealy-mouthed explanation of what happened to Texas last week, this is not the hour to tune in. If you're looking for the truth, stay tuned. So Jason Isaac, I'm going to turn to you first. You're a former legislator, and by that I will tell our audience they should still listen to you. You're one of the good guys. And you've been for many years, even prior to coming to Texas Public Policy Foundation and leading Life Powered, a champion for right policy on energy. Before we get into some of the detail that you have a great command on, what at sort of a high level happened last week for our audience to understand?
Well, at the Life Powered Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation here, we make the connection between access to energy and human flourishing. And humans weren't flourishing last week in Texas because of some policy discussions that have been happening for decades that we'll get into. But what happened last week was demand skyrocketed. Demand for energy skyrocketed on Sunday evening and early Monday morning. That's Valentine's night and President's Day morning. And there wasn't enough supply to meet demand. And so what our grid manager is supposed to do is force demand lower by beginning rolling outages. And you take people offline to force the demand lower so that we keep a charge or a frequency in the lines. And when that doesn't happen, if it gets too low, you start to trip power plants. And that's what happened. And it's almost like the regulators were asleep at the wheel. They woke up at the last second, right before the deer, and they kind of hit the deer and swerved at the same time, and then began rolling outages. And that's where they continued to make bad decisions. And they made some decisions that impacted gas supply for residential users, for other power plants in the state of Texas that hadn't tripped offline, and essentially cut natural gas supply by implementing rolling outages in the Permian to less than 25% of its normal supply, a massive decrease in natural gas supply.
So let me just underscore that, if you don't mind, pardon the interjection. For our audience, maybe not paying as much attention as we were last week as you were, at the time, we needed more natural gas to keep the lights on. Our manager of our electric grid was turning off power to those plants that would provide the natural gas.
Yes, either ERCOT or the local municipality, someone made a decision to shut off the pumps, the substations in the Permian, that was the largest producing energy field, I think, in the world, providing natural gas to those that are generating electricity using that natural gas. Just mind-blowing that happened. We talk a lot about at Life Powered that heating deaths, for every one heating death, you'll experience 20 cold-related deaths. I thought this was going to happen last August. I thought this would happen in August with the summertime demand, not in a February. It is much more dangerous for this to be happening in a wintertime. And we're already seeing at least 40 deaths attributable to this outbreak of poor decisions at our regulator.
You know, it reminds me of another natural disaster, weather-related, obviously, Hurricane Katrina, where there were a lot of questions, fittingly, about government response to that disaster. In fact, there were similar questions, I would say, regarding the Corps of Engineers and what they did with the levee system in and around New Orleans. And for people who were outraged about that, regardless of your philosophical inclinations, but particularly if you've been reading the nonsense from the New York Times, if you're outraged in 2005 about Katrina, you ought to have the similar outrage for similar reasons about what happened last week in Texas. And so, Emily Pataki, you have this unique perspective because you are on the board and board president and truly of the greatest electric utility in the world, the Pedernales Electric Co-op.
Well said.
And it's true. And I can say as customers that, you know, if you're out shopping for real estate in Central Texas and you can buy a home that is served by your utility, you do it. I mean, it is that good. And so it was shocking when even we, great customers of PEC, were going through these outages last week too. What are you thinking in that moment, and what's your high level analysis about what happened before we get into some of the detail?
Sure. Well, well, first of all, thanking you for the chance is important to talk about this in the first place. I haven't had a chance to just stop since this all kicked off. So I really haven't had a debrief opportunity. So thank you for that. And I think also it goes without saying, it must be set up front. What carried us through this terrible set of circumstances was the culture and the people that we have that work at PEC. When systems failed, when things didn't go exactly as we thought they might, it was their dedication to the membership and their dedication to our mission that got people back to a good place. So I have to thank them up front.
Amen.
I think what was difficult for a company like us is that we, especially in the last 6 years, since we've really changed things at the board level and our perspective, is that we've recommitted to our simple but profound mission to deliver affordable, reliable, and safe power to our members at all times. I think I tried to get a more recent update than 2018, but the average that I saw from 2018 for amount of time that people are off power in the United States is upwards of 2 hours across the country. We had, I think last year, an average of 45 minutes. So we are one of the most reliable utilities in the country. And we do that because we maintain a really good system and we have really great people doing that. So to be in a position where it's not how it usually goes, where we have outages due to weather or someone hits a pole and we get those people back on quickly and it's localized, we were in a situation where we had to take people off the grid. That's a very painful place when you don't have the practice of having to do that all the time. So I think what really happened, you said you lost power in Georgetown. Our house was out of power for over 24 hours, and we had people that had worse situations than that, is when you have a significant weather event like what we had where it covers the entire territory, which doesn't often happen, you are going to have system-related outages due to ice and whatever other situation might cause a problem. And congruent with that, at times you have forced outages sitting on top of those other outages. So you have a problem where two causes are happening at the same time and our systems aren't necessarily designed to pick that difference up. So those are some of the things that we picked up midstream with that culture to get into it, manually make adjustments and get people back that were no longer like on a rolling outage, but a true outage. And I think they did a great job of that. And moving forward, we're certainly going to look at those systems to make sure we can prepare for something like this in the future.
Well, I know you've had a long several days, and whether through your leadership or the linemen who were working so hard on the outages that were not controllable, they're ice related and wind related, to the folks in the control rooms, just know our gratitude for what y'all do every day, and for anyone who is out there making that happen, our first responders as well. Our very plain spoken, well, I'll just say our bluntness about what happened in no way is a lack of gratitude for folks like Emily and first responders and linemen who allowed us to recover from this so quickly. In fact, it's gratitude for them that makes us outraged on behalf of the people of Texas that this kind of nonsense could happen. Someone who's a specialist in nonsense, my friend Chuck DeVore, former member of the California legislature, that's where the specialist in nonsense comes in. You have a lot of expertise you can share with us, Chuck, and I'm going to try to pull out as much of that as I can. But before we go any further, for people who know something weird happened in Texas and they're not familiar with all the vocabulary, Jason Isaac gave us a wonderful top-level analysis. We got a great kind of sidewalk level analysis from Emily from the utility side. there's this thing in the middle called ERCOT. What are they, and what was their role, and what happened?
So ERCOT is Texas's independent system operator. It's a 501c4, and it basically is made up of a membership of pretty much everyone that has anything to do with generating and consuming power in Texas. So there are a few, for example, wind power people there. I think the leader is even from Michigan. There's someone on the board from Germany, and there's people that represent big industrial consumers. So it's a polyglot, right? And those are that's the crew then that provides kind of the policy guidance to the professionals who try to keep the lights on. And all of that then is overseen, not commanded by, but overseen by the Texas Public Utilities Commission, who has a membership appointed by Governor Greg Abbott. So it really is independent of government, although it is a government-like entity. And it is ERCOT that the proximate cause, I think, of some of the outages that we had on Sunday night, Monday morning that Jason outlined can be laid at their feet for perhaps responding too slowly. They keep speaking in kind of passive voice when they try to excuse what's happened, kind of intimating to a sympathetic media that most of the outages were due to thermal plants failing because of the cold weather. The problem with that, as we've been gradually assembling information, is that the temperature gradient across a state as huge as Texas is very different from one end of the cold front to the other. It takes hours for this thing to move in. And you have various plants at various locations running on various types of fuel with various designs. And the likelihood of having multiple plants failing very soon to each other in that sort of a weather event and have it due to cold weather is very, very minimal, because the cold is going to affect different plants at different times, depending again on how they're designed and where they are, right? Not all at once. It would suggest, the circumstantial evidence would suggest that in fact the plants tripped offline because the grid went unstable and the frequency of 60 hertz dropped and the voltage dropped, and the plants had to do that to protect themselves, because if they remained connected to the grid, you would have seen significant damage to the control equipment in those plants. And instead of minutes or hours, it would have been days or weeks before they could have been back online. So that seems to be the proximate cause, we think, of the failure. And it's interesting to see how much coverage is being given right now by the corporate media and some of their allies, some of the folks that are into the unreliables, as we call them, the wind and solar industry, because they want to do everything they can to shift blame to the more reliable coal and gas and nuclear fired power plants and away from wind and solar. But it's really the wind and solar where the problem is, and not necessarily because of that drop in production as the front came through, but rather 20 years of policy that led into it, where both the federal government and the state government were subsidizing these forms of energy. And because of our energy-only market in Texas, our free market, it caused investors to shift money, 20,000 megawatts worth of money, into wind and solar, as our coal and gas declined by a net of 3,000 megawatts over just the last few years. If you do that for too long, the grid becomes less and less reliable, to the point that when we have a 40 or 50-year weather event like we just had, you mix that decline in safety margin with perhaps a bureaucracy that wasn't as on the ball as it should have been, and then you have a recipe for disaster.
That's right, and it's really well laid out, Chuck, so thanks for that. We've been convinced the last couple of summers, Jason, that we would encounter this problem in the summer. Last summer, as I think you suggested, we probably saved one silver lining from COVID and related shutdowns. This is going to happen again unless we change something. So what's that something that needs to change? Usually when we're having these policy conversations, as you know, I ask our policy leaders, I'm going to give you a magic wand. What are you going to do with it? And it really is sort of fantastical dreaming. In this case, there's a real opportunity to fix it. And so here's the magic wand for our audience, some of whom are real experts, some of whom are just generalists like I am. What are we going to do to make sure this never happens?
Well, you're absolutely right. We've seen our what's called a reserve margin drop from double digits just in the last 10 years, 20% reserve margin. That's essentially extra capacity. I like to refer to that as your emergency food on the shelf that we got into late this past week. You know, the elbow macaroni and chili, things that you don't normally eat, but they're great together when you're hungry. Stuff like that. That reserve margin has gone down to less than 2% this past summer. Well, it completely disappeared. And it disappeared because of poor policies. And this is what we've been recommending. And Chuck talked about the market distorting policies that have been put in place that's favoring one type of unreliable generation over reliable generation. We've seen 3,000 megawatts of thermal generation drop off in the last 5 years. That's coal or natural gas or nuclear. An increase of 20,000 megawatts of unreliable variable generation. And it's quite honestly, it's the subsidies that have put this in place that have given wind a $20 per megawatt advantage over their competitors, have given solar an over $80 per megawatt hour advantage over their competitors. So these unreliables, and it's one of our legislative action agenda items that's on our website, texaspolicy.com. It says if you're going to be unreliable generation on the grid, you've got to have reliable, dispatchable, readily available electricity for the grid so that our grid managers can better plan. Hopefully it'll be new managers soon that can better plan and prepare for these instances. And another thing that we need to stop is this discrimination against energy. You're seeing the massive amounts of investments going into unreliable electric generation. And it's because, quite honestly, you have banks and financial institutions that discriminate against reliable energy because it's demonized by the left. When it's incredible here in Texas has done amazing things for our economy and our environment in this country. And shouldn't the rest of the world get to experience the clean environment that we have here in Texas and the United States? But you've got these large companies like BlackRock, Bank of the West, JP Morgan that are discriminating and not allowing investments of their dollars, which in some cases is Texas tax dollars, the dollars of employees that are investing into their 401ks. Not allowing those dollars to be invested if they're in the business of producing fossil fuels or forestry products or agriculture products. This is appalling and it needs to stop. I'm encouraged by our lieutenant governor claiming over the last few weeks that this would be a priority piece of legislation to end this discrimination in the state of Texas, and that will certainly help.
Well, there's a lot of work to be done there. We have some legislative hearings coming up later this week. I'll come back to you on that point. But before moving into that, it's such a treat to have you here, Emily, because you're going to be able to give us a bird's eye view into what one really important electric utility is going to do in light of this new reality. You know, you've seen this because you're smart and you analyze these things, that we're going to have this problem, but you weren't necessarily expecting to encounter this on the evening of Valentine's Day. So given your position as board president of PEC, what are y'all talking about now that you can do in order to avoid this, if you can, for your customers?
Well, there are a few things we're talking about. I talked about reprogramming our systems to pick up things that we used to not have to anticipate. It's unfortunate to think about it, but yeah, we're looking at a future where this could happen in the next few months, and we have to prepare ourselves to, when we get that call, recalibrate things so we can keep more predictable outages for people, communicate with community leaders, whether it be city councils, city managers, county officials, to make sure our critical care infrastructure forms are up to date. We had some water plant issues where simply forms are not up to date because we're so reliable, it probably wasn't a priority to get that corrected. Those are the things that we can do because we are committed to doing a great job regardless of the environment that we're in. One thing that is a little bit out of our control, we're waiting to see how things shake out here in the next week, but different companies will have performed financially better than others. We are really hoping that we're able to absorb what has happened here because of the smart choices that we've made and the conservative policies that we've had. If in the interest of trying to help people, some of those costs are socialized across the system, that would be very unfortunate for our members because our team, our power providers worked really hard to take care of them, and that just, it wouldn't be right in my opinion.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was just thinking about the text thread with our 12 or 13 neighbors in Liberty Hill, all on PEC, that we're so proud to be customers. There are some folks in the audience here, including the online audience, who are, and y'all, because of the good work that y'all do, you should not be penalized because of the foolishness of either other utility providers or because of ERCOT or the Public Utilities Commission. And I'll just say it really plainly. If you're a member of the legislature and you don't fix this, you are ignoring the gravest threat to the Texas model, to the Texas miracle that exists. Not just in terms of energy outages and human lives being lost, unfortunately. There's no hyperbole there, it's true. We as Texans expect better. And I can tell you with the full influence of the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Life Powered, this must change. If we don't do that, Chuck, we become California. And that's not hyperbole either. And you know, not just because you've lived there and you serve there, but because you have spent a big chunk of your career here at this foundation analyzing how Texas needs to avoid the California path. Explain that for us.
So Texas and California have kind of arrived at the same problem, but through different paths, right? In California, the path to blackouts, and you're likely going to see more blackouts in California and the Western interconnection region of the 13 states this summer, they arrived at it through mandates that constantly increase the requirement on their grid to have renewable, unreliable energy. In California, it's mostly solar. Here in Texas, it's mostly wind. The problem, though, is the same. In California, you have what's called a duckbill curve, where every afternoon as the solar comes down, you need a huge increase in thermal capacity, a little bit in batteries. They add more batteries now, to make up that gap. It's about a 25,000 megawatt gap that they're expecting this summer. So what California is trying to do is gradually increase battery farms to be able to capture that extra energy. The problem is the more unreliables you have on your grid, the amount of batteries that you need goes up dramatically. And in the case of the storm that went through a few days ago, Texas has batteries as well, but because of the enormously cold temperatures, they lost 60% of their capacity. Batteries don't work all that well in the cold. So Texas, though, arrived at it through a different sort of policy. In Texas, you have these very large federal and state subsidies for wind and for solar. So much so, in fact, that at times, especially at night, wind produces so much extra electricity in Texas when it's not frankly needed, that prices go negative. And they still make money, even though they pay the grid to take the power. They make money off the tax credits that they only get if they make electricity. Well, this sort of distortion of the marketplace then puts a lot of pressure on coal and natural gas operators and investors that would otherwise build them. They look at this and go, I'm not going to build another natural gas plant. I'll never build a coal plant. In fact, we'll prematurely retire the ones we have. And so then that makes the Texas grid more and more vulnerable to these sorts of events. One last thing that's very interesting is that many of our municipalities in Texas, you see it in Austin, you see it in San Antonio, are run by city council members that love to tout the fact that there's zero carbon and that they're increasing the amount of renewable energy. Well, in the case of Austin, Austin used to export a fair amount of power. Austin Power did. They had 3 thermal plants. Now they have 1.5. They've divested themselves of fossil fuel. And so the margin that they produced in electricity is significantly less. So they were not pulling their weight this last week. But it looks good on the propaganda when you run for re-election and you want to look for votes from UT professors, I suppose. So the other problem that Texas has is we have a lot of really big corporations that also like to virtue signal. They're woke companies and they like to say, yes, we're zero carbon. There's 2 things about that. Not only can they claim they're zero carbon because they have contracts with these wind fields out in West Texas, many of them ironically owned by foreign governments like France. But they say, look, we're zero carbon, but it's also low cost electricity that they have these contracts with. So for the companies in the manufacturing sector, it's a win-win. The problem is that the costs of unreliability and lack of resiliency are socialized on the rest of the grid, meaning we Texans get to pay either more for electricity or for hours shivering in the dark so that these companies can woke virtue signal to the world that they're low carbon. That needs to be changed too.
Well, it does, and that's been a frustration of ours for a long time, and want to follow up with each of you regarding this question about messaging and communication, communicating the truth. Then we'll get to audience questions. So Emily, I'm going to come to you first on that question, given your perspective, not just on the board, but obviously you've got a family as well. You see the world like all of our audience does. How do we cut through really untruthful messaging about what happened and persuade the regular Texan who wants to understand what happened so we can fix it, so that they know that what the legislature specifically needs to do this week?
That's not an easy answer,
No,
but
it
I
isn't.
think that we are so used to being transparent at PEC. I had members calling, emailing me back and forth at their homes, making sure we could troubleshoot their issues. As the board president of a utility that serves 1 million people, they could get access to me. As I said, we're working with our communities to figure out what we didn't do as well as we want to do, and we're making those adjustments. It's going to take that transparency and openness, and what I used to tell people when I went to school in a different part of the country that made me so proud about being a Texan is we didn't run from our problems. We always found whatever the challenge was and rose to that challenge, which is what always has made us resilient. And I think there's an opportunity to do that here. If people can just really, they're welcome to steal our mission, provide reliable power so that people will get it whenever they need it, regardless of the circumstance. Make it affordable so that families like mine with 5 kids or disabled veterans or people on a fixed income can count on a bill that they can predict into their monthly costs. And then make sure it has the right environmental consciousness, not just what's the temperature, what's the climate, but what does our landscape look like? How are we recycling these products that are really big and we don't know where to put them? Those are the questions that seem to only be targeted at certain types of generation, and they're not targeted at other places. But if we're being honest and really trying to get a holistic approach to good solutions, everyone's got to have that simple mission of safety, affordability, and reliability.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad to see you emphasize that. If we do those things, and especially if the legislature does, which I expect them to do, there's similar outrage by members of the legislature we visited with. So we're confident about what's going to happen. If we could just focus on transparency in the subsidies that are given, we're picking winners and losers in the market, which means that we had millions of losers, Texans, Jason, this last week, then I think we will have accomplished a lot. But Jason, I'm going to ask you to pick up on something that Emily mentioned, and that is, how do we get there? How, just sort of nuts and bolts, how do we communicate to people more broadly in spite of everything the New York Times is saying, outlets here in Texas? People are consuming news and they're being persuaded by something that's just not at all based on data. How do we get past that?
Well, I think you get everybody to go to thecanononline.com and see the facts.
Great plug.
So I absolutely have to plug that because I have repeatedly over the last week or two, because there's been pieces from us and our team and others sharing the truth out there. And so when I'm looking for something, that's where I go to get some more information. It's been really interesting. If you look at my Twitter trolls feeding my fun and my snark, some of the guys on the Unreliable said, well, a ton of batteries is on the way. And I thought Chuck would really laugh at that, because Chuck did the math a couple of years ago with Georgetown, right, and a ton would do nothing for Georgetown, and it's going to do nothing for Texas. You're going to need millions of tons of batteries. And it's actually projected by 2025, get this, the battery capacity will have doubled, and it will now be available to provide 0.4% of our electric needs here in Texas. That's awesome. I think that's 56 minutes that the lights will be on, then they're going to be off for the rest of the day until those batteries can charge. So we've got to look at the facts, the science, and the math, and that's what we need to communicate effectively to people, things like that. When you look at, again, the loss of thermal generation, the increase of unreliable generation, we need to look at that and what policies are put in place. And so I think that's how we effectively communicate. Just look at the math and the science. And when you're solar and you've got a $20 per megawatt advantage over your thermal competitors, why is that there? Why is that there? Because I think it happened on Saturday. Electricity went to below zero because wind and solar were picking up so much. So what does that mean? That wind and solar and they get priority access to the grid because of the lowest cost. They can pay their consumers to take their product and still make money. How can our thermal, natural gas, clean coal, nuclear, hydro compete with that? They can't. And people don't understand that. And people need to know that that's what gets priority access to the grid. So there needs to be some changes this legislative session. I'm sorry I didn't fight enough for some of these changes and to eliminate market distorting policies, but I'm certainly calling for those changes now, and hopefully our friends up the street will listen to not only us, but to the people that they serve in the state of Texas.
Yeah, and to emphasize a theme that y'all have made repeatedly already in today's live stream, it's that, yes, this was a debacle, and unfortunately with a lot of human tragedy associated with it, and yet this is still Texas. And so we're going to learn from this mistake, and it's a mistake in policy, a mistake in not having enough transparency with the ERCOT board, maybe even with the PUC board, but we got to go fix it. And so Chuck, one last question before we turn to the audience, and I'm sure the audience questions will be even better than mine. And that is, I believe that the left, the real radical left, we may have run-of-the-mill liberals who are great people trying to understand, but the real radical left, academic left, maybe at UT a few blocks north of here, they've succeeded in convincing many Texans that if you're going to have power generated by fossil fuels, that's not environmentally conscious. And am I overstating it to say that's a false dichotomy, and that in fact, it's more environmentally conscious to in fact power our grid with fossil fuels?
Yeah, so first of all, it's amazing that they just say that sort of thing and then are never challenged, right? Emily Pataki hinted at where do you put some of these things when they're used up? I mean, you know, out in the hill country, of course, we see these blades for the turbines go by that are as big as a wing for a 737. And eventually they get old and they need to be decommissioned and recycled. Similarly, if you look at photovoltaics, the amount of rare earth elements and other materials that go in to make those does an enormous amount of environmental damage in the mining. And then of course it needs to be recycled. Similarly, lithium-ion batteries or other types of batteries, again, require an enormous amount of mining. Wind turbines, if you look at the amount of steel and cement that goes into putting those up, and you compare it to, for example, nuclear power, you'd find that nuclear power produces hundreds of times more power with less of an environmental footprint than you get out of wind turbines. So there's trade-offs with everything. One of the interesting things about oil and natural gas is if you look at the size of the footprint of a modern fracking rig and how many different wells it can sink from that same little 40-acre pad or less, what you find is there is so much more energy produced out of a very small footprint compared to several dozen square miles of wind turbines. So again, everything is a trade-off, right? All forms of energy come at some cost to the environment, but you have to look at the benefits to humanity, to a higher standard of living, to longer lifespans. Everything is connected in this regard, and you can't just simply focus on one aspect of the food chain of energy, right? And I think that's one of the unfortunate things that in today's culture with our corporate media, they barely scratch the surface on these questions. They really don't ask the tough questions that they should be asking about the costs of different forms of energy.
Yeah, that's really well said, Chuck. So I'm looking at the questions coming in. If you're in the audience, you have a question, just go to the comments box of whatever channel you're on and list that there. We'll try to get through as many of these as we can. Jason, I'm going to pitch this first one to you. And this audience member asks, the media is saying wind turbines performed exactly as they were expected to. So how is this wind's fault?
It's interesting when your expectations are set so low and you can literally lift a toe and cross the hurdle. That's what wind was doing. Installed capacity of 32 gigawatts or 32,000 megawatts. And at the height of this tragedy, they were getting 600 megawatts of electricity. And that was just right around what ERCOT had projected. At some points they fell below projections, some points they were up above projections. And that's when the wind trolls on my Twitter feed came out and were like, hey, we're above projections. You're above zero. Congratulations, because there was nothing expected of you and you delivered 100% of the time. I mean, that's how low the expectations were. Sure, there were some issues with natural gas dropping off because, as I mentioned, the load and the frequency in the lines triggered some plants as a safety mechanism to drop off because ERCOT didn't start rolling outages soon enough. And then those plants, those are thermal plants, heat up water. Water is freezing at the temperatures we experience. Natural gas, I think, was at 41% capacity, installed capacity at their lowest point, and their production of electricity increased over 400%. So natural gas really was able to ramp up and have this dispatchable electricity for us, but wind was performing exactly, if not sometimes a little bit below. Sometimes they exceeded expectations. It was so incredibly low expectations, and that's why we've got to have some sort of reliability built in, where wind and solar are going to have to build peaker plants to be able to guarantee a certain load when it's needed.
Great answer, Jason. Related question for you, Emily, about PEC specifically, but you can, of course, take this more broadly for electric utilities generally. And that is, what's your mix of energy sources, gas, coal, wind? How do you think it's going to change as a result of what's happened this last week?
Well, of course, a lot of that's confidential because it has to do with contracts.
Sure.
We have a blend of the market, but we've never shied away from using a particular source for a political reason, which has, as I said, given us the ability to keep our low rates. Since I joined the board in 2014, we've only lowered our rates 7 times consecutively. If you look at the general landscape of utilities in Texas, that has not been the case. Maybe there's not another one that has done that. They might have been able to do it for some amount of time, but it's that consistent commitment to, let's look at what's affordable and we'll go for that. I wish we had more options, to be honest with you, but we take what options we get, make those determinations about, is it going to be reliable? Is it going to be affordable? And we go that way.
Yeah, I mean, y'all have just been picture perfect of showing how affordability and reliability are not competing aims. They really can happen. And I think that's really the theme coming out of this. And frankly, just think about the title of this live stream. This is the energy state. I think most people, even if they don't like our Texas bravado, folks outside Texas are thinking, how in the world could this happen to Texas? So Chuck, let's pick up with that rhetorical question, which in fact we have answered quite a bit. A related question, the one I pitched to Emily, and this audience member asks, how do all these technologies, gas, coal, wind, for example, keep the power on in much colder climates, northern United States and northern Europe in particular?
So first of all, to kind of take off of something that Emily Pataki said about the mix, unfortunately though, if PEC was, let's say, 100% clean coal and all the plants operated, we're still part of ERCOT's grid and there still would have been blackouts, right? Because you have to share the pain. You're all part of the same grid. So that's important to understand.
Thank you.
So in Texas, we produce more wind power than any other state. We also are the biggest consumer and producer of electricity. So for here, because of the fact that our extreme weather typically happens in the summer, we don't put much money, for example, into winterizing wind turbines. And it's very hard to retrofit them. You know, you have to have the equipment already on the blades when they're installed. You do have some wind turbines, for example, up in New York that have that sort of equipment, but it costs more. The maintenance is going to be more, and therefore it's going to be passed to consumers. It's important to understand that the weather we just experienced is a 40 or 50-year event. This doesn't happen every winter. So up in northern climes, yes, you do see much more winterization, but there's other problems that go to politics. For example, in New York, Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio have banned the construction of additional natural gas pipelines. And as a result, they can't get any more industry to locate in New York because there's no power for them. And meanwhile, just south of the border in Pennsylvania, you have all this natural gas from the Marcellus Shale. And so what happened a couple winters ago? Well, they ran out of gas. You know where they got the gas from to keep the Northeast going? Russia. Russia, when all that gas was south of the border in Pennsylvania. So it's important to understand that politics plays a heavy hand in these sorts of decisions about the investments you make in winterization. And one last thing about winterization. Texas has done some winterization. We did some after the 2011 winter cold snap. And critics are saying, well, you need to do more. Here's the problem. We could completely winterize our entire network of grid and power plants, and we're still going to see this problem increasingly in the future, because as long as we keep adding more wind and solar and taking away coal and natural gas, you're going to have a problem when the unreliables aren't producing. There's just not going to be enough power to go around, period, end of story. The only way, if you're going to keep adding unreliables to keep the grid going, is if you have massive investments in battery farms and thermal plants that are going to sit on standby for 300 days out of the year. They're going to be staffed, they're going to be maintained, they're going to be ready to go. And then when wind drops off and there's no solar, they're going to spring to life. Well, how much money do you think that's going to take to build that stuff out? It's going to be enormously costly for Texas ratepayers and for the businesses that have moved to Texas.
Well, and that's what we're seeing in California, right? That in fact, there's a whole cottage industry of these plants just to come online when the grid fails. And then you wonder, well, why is that okay for people who are so concerned about the environment? Because you're using those same sources of energy that cause the problem. So Jason, Chuck mentioned this 4-letter word called politics. And to 3 people who have stood for office and been elected, you've not heard it from me first when I say that money is the grease of the wheels of politics, right? And so that comes in the form of taxpayer transfers. One member of our audience, Jason, asks you this question: do you have the amount, the annual amount of state and federal taxpayer transfers of our wealth to wind companies?
We do, and it's at the website texaspolicy.com. I was just absolutely, doing some screenshots and sending that over to some friends in the building. And it's interesting because, again, you look at my Twitters and feed, and so, the snarks will get in there and they'll say, well, wind saved ratepayers $1 billion last year. So they're putting $1 in your pocket and they're taking $1.50 out of the other pocket, because that's what wind is getting in state subsidies, $1.5 billion. That's just Texas subsidies in the form of property tax exemptions, in the form of Crestline money that's actually coming out of your utility bill to run those lines from low dense population centers out in the middle of beautiful rural areas of Texas to move that power to where it's needed. Those are incredibly long lines. And when there is reliable generation in city centers, but they've been demonized, so they've been pushed out. That's a big concern with what Chuck mentioned with the city of Austin. Used to generate more electricity for the grid. Not the case. It's not the case. It's going to happen in San Antonio, where people should be alarmed. It was, I think, January 25th, the city of San Antonio put the word out that they want to talk about shuttering the Spruce coal-fired power plant, forcing CPS Energy to shut this plant that provides revenue for ratepayers that are CPS Energy customers and reliable electricity to the grid. In 2019, it was over $130 million of revenue to CPS Energy that came from the grid, essentially moving money back into the city of San Antonio. They want that to go away. That weakens the grids. Our friends in the legislature should pay attention to those rogue cities that are trying to get rid of natural gas utilities in people's homes, denying them choice. We had a lot of kids come over to our home yesterday to take showers for the first time in a week. They had gas so they could keep their homes warm around the fireplace, but they didn't have electricity or water. And so denying consumers choice in that aspect hurts consumers. So I probably rambled on too much, but hopefully that gets to the point of some of the politics that we're dealing with here in the state of Texas.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did. It was not rambling. It was actually very articulate and very thorough. A lot of the conversations I've had with neighbors, even with family members in other states, who just automatically think that wind and solar kind of give you, warm fuzzies inside. I said, they might give you warm fuzzies inside, but they don't keep you warm in the middle of a winter storm. The point is that all of us love the concept of a completely clean environment and reliable energy. I mean, that's the Texas Public Policy Foundation would be at the top of the list saying that's the goal. We basically have that. We've made tremendous strides as a people. The United States and Texas, our clean air, our clean water. We can do that and avoid what happened last week.
I want to jump in real quick.
Absolutely.
There's 3.8 million people that die every year from illnesses attributed to indoor air quality. And some of those people are subjected to conditions here in Texas, or I've read stories about people burning furniture in their homes to heat their homes. That's what less than just right at a billion people around the world have to do every single day. They're not burning furniture. They're burning wood that they're collecting, that women are collecting, and biomass that women are predominantly collecting to burn in their homes, really not empowering women around the world.
Yeah, that's really well said. So we have time for a couple more audience questions. Next one will come to you, Emily. And this audience member is asking from your perspective, given your board membership at PEC, looking to this week's legislative hearings, what would your specific recommendations be for them coming from your expertise?
I would, as I said before, hope that they find a way to help people without harming other people in terms of the financial fallout from this. I think we need to do a better job of pushing the good things that have been happening in Texas that have come as a benefit of reliable power. We have cleaner fossil fuel generation than we ever have through gas and even cleaner coal technology. And that's a good thing. And we need to be trying to help those things continue and be proliferated. I think something that we do well at PEC is we have worked with our business partners and developers to teach conservation in the home and at businesses. We do demand side management, which basically what that means is when we get into a hot summer and we communicate with our big industrial people or big companies that we're moving into a peak time, they lower what use they need if they don't absolutely need it. And that helps prevent another outage type situation. We need to be educating people how they can do that. And then just the Texas resiliency model that we have, the new things that we're building are so much more efficient than we used to be in terms of the way we build home structures and businesses. I think last year we added close to 20,000 new meters to our territory. That's bigger than the size of a regular electric cooperative across the country. And yet the percentage growth that we had in energy use attributed with the new load was decreased. Yeah. Because we're building better, we're serving better, everything we're doing is more efficient. So I think before we can get everything corrected in the long term and the near term, if we focus on energy conservation, education, demand side management with people that can pull a lot of load off the grid and it doesn't harm them, those are two things we could do immediately to help.
Yeah, those are real important reminders. I think a lot of folks right now who've been tracking this closely, whether they're in the audience today or not, understand that the legislature is going to do something. And it's difficult, I mean, to nod to political realities for a member of either political party in the legislature to just kind of check the box and move on. This isn't one of those exercises. They're expecting the legislature to make some hard choices, but they're also recognizing individual Texans that maybe there's something we can do. And that's what I really like about your comments there. So Chuck, a kind of tough question for you. It's a political hot potato, but it's a question that has to be asked and that Texans deserve an answer for. Should we abolish ERCOT? And what should we do with the board of the Public Utilities Commission?
Yeah, those are both really tough questions. So ERCOT is, I mentioned before, is a 501c4, so it's a nonprofit and is a constituent of all the people who use and create power in Texas. And then the Public Utilities Commission, of course, is a creature of government, all appointed by the governor. Now, Governor Abbott called for the resignation of the ERCOT board within days of this crisis. And I think he was correct to do so, but he has no power to do so. The only way that you can get rid of ERCOT as currently constituted is through legislation. And I think that that's likely going to be coming in this legislative session. That said, I think we need to be very mindful of ensuring that whatever we do to replace ERCOT is not worse than the devil we know. ERCOT had a major stumble. They compounded errors through what I believe to be incompetence on Sunday night and Monday morning that was compounded by 20 years of bad policy that eroded our safety margin to the point that bad decisions could result in far worse consequences. As far as the Public Utilities Commission, you have commissioners that listen to guidance from the governor, and if they don't want to listen, they can be replaced. And so I think in the case of the PUC, it's simply a matter of who is sitting on the PUC. I don't necessarily think At this point, it's time to revisit their regulatory ambit, but rather who's on it and to whom are they responding, right? What are their objectives? What are they trying to do? And I think that is perfectly within the scope of both the legislature through its oversight function and the governor to determine how best to move forward with the Public Utilities Commission.
Certainly a time for bold action.
I certainly think so, certainly with regards ERCOT. And for goodness sakes, Texas is a big place. Let's not have people from other countries and other states on the board managing Texas's electricity needs.
Yeah, particularly as someone who's written the green energy plan for another state, leading ERCOT. So, but at the risk of opining myself about that, I'll go to the last question, which I ask all of our guests. You know, we started this live stream series last March. Proud to say that this foundation had its office closed for just 2 weeks. We're back in person, obviously colleagues who needed to take special circumstances because of health continue to do that. But the point is we're here in person, and this live stream has become a source of optimism for people in Texas and beyond. And so even though today we've hit hard and we've done it on purpose because circumstances demand it, I want to be sure that we conclude by giving each of you the opportunity to tell us why you're still hopeful, both about the policy issue we've dealt with today, but also about Texas and about America. It's been a long 15 months for Americans, for Texans. I think both brands, the American brand and the Texas brand, are feeling a little beat up right now, but I know each of you well enough to know you're optimists at your core. So Chuck, we'll start with you. Why should we be hopeful?
Well, I'm optimistic for a few reasons regarding Texas. Of course, Texans are being the number one reason to be optimistic. But because we have control over our own grid that covers 85 to 90% of Texas, that means that we are relatively free from federal interference to tell us how to manage our own affairs. Now, that doesn't mean we're exempt from things like environmental edicts or the new president telling us to, comply with the Paris Accords and an unratified treaty, by the way. So having our own grid allows us then the ability to much more rapidly assess the problem and put in place fixes and not have to go through the slow motion, bureaucratic molasses of having to be entangled with the federal government and getting permission to change things from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. So I'm optimistic for that reason, because it's our problem. We largely made it with some federal help with the subsidies. I think we can largely fix it.
Thank you. Emily Pataki.
I'm a 7th generation Texan, so I'm eternally hopeful about this state. I think it's still the best place to raise a family, build a business, decide things for ourselves, to Chuck's point. I think what makes me very hopeful is that, unlike other places like Germany, let's say, we are a resources rich state. We can just make some changes to access those resources in a clean way and in a reliable way and an affordable way, and we can fix this problem. So I believe the right people are thinking about it and they have good intentions. So I'm going to support those people and hope that we can put our heads together and get something worked out in the near term.
Yeah, thank you. Jason.
I'm optimistic because people are talking about energy, and that's the mission of Life Powered, is to raise America's energy IQ. And so more and more Texans and really people around the world are engaged in this topic. And so although I'm upset that this has happened because it has resulted in loss of life, but I'm optimistic because it happened in February while we're in a legislative session in Texas, and more attention is being paid to this. So I think there's going to be some incredible opportunities to increase resiliency, hopefully with a focus on affordability. I love Emily's words on affordable, reliable electricity, because there are going to be a lot of lobbyists up the street knocking on doors, talking about how they would love to spend more money so that they can pass those costs on to ratepayers. And that is a big concern, that there's going to be billions potentially wasted on winterization. But now that people are waking up, they're going to continue to pressure and communicate more with their elected officials, the people that serve Texans, that work in the building up the street. And so I'm optimistic that those legislators are going to be hearing more from their elected officials to make sure that we do have put the reliability back in ERCOT, but also my suggestion is to add an affordability component to ERCOT as well. And maybe we rename it ERCOT or something like that. But I'm optimistic there's going to be some positive changes for Texans, and that hopefully by August, we won't run into this problem again.
I will second that and say that based on the conversations we've had with legislative leaders, that we're expecting very candid hearings this week and a real focus on policy. We wish, of course, that that happened before a disaster that cost people their lives. But to Emily's point, this is Texas. We're going to learn our lesson when we get it fixed. I'll also say, just to use a little Texas common sense, for people who hear all these details, all these numbers, and their heads are swimming, it's really easy to understand who's right. What you heard from Jason Isaac, Emily Pataki, Chuck DeVore is right, because almost every well-paid lobbyist in this town is on the other side. And so that's really all you need to do. It's just a great rule of thumb. 95% of well-funded lobbyists, some of whom are watching this today, hi, you're on the wrong side. And what happened over the last 10 days, I think, can be fixed by legislators who are willing to stop taking that money, stop taking those calls, and do what's right for the people of Texas. That's why I'm optimistic. So God bless you, especially if you've been affected terribly by this disaster. Thank you, Chuck and Emily and Jason, for your great words. Tune in next week where we'll tackle another really easy topic. And in the meantime, know that we're going to keep smiling, because this is Texas. God bless you.